Now, the rest of the story. Ben Franklin was a brilliant man. Invented the Pennsylvania fireplace, discovered polarity in electricity, invented the lightning rod, discovered the cooling effect of evaporation, charted the Gulf Stream, and he invented bifocal glasses. And he did all of that in his spare time. Ben Franklin, as I say, was a brilliant man. So why during the American Revolution did the American colonists reject his secret weapon? Today's historians and militarists agree that if the Continental Army had used that device, we would have beaten the British sooner and much more easily. In fact, Ben Franklin's weapon was so superior to the 18th century musket, and it still is, in many ways, so superior, period, that it's been used effectively on battlefields as recently as the Vietnam War. So why in the world did our founding fathers reject that best weapon? Why, indeed. Franklin himself first proposed it to General Charles Lee, George Washington's second in command. In a letter to Lee, Franklin outlined the advantages, and Lee in turn passed the proposal along to a committee on munitions appointed by the Continental Congress. Military strategists were consulted, and it's there that Ben's better idea died. Ben Franklin was right, you know. From the objective perspective of modern military know-how, we see that his weapon was vastly preferable to the common, badly bored musket of his era. For example, the musket was inaccurate at 100 yards. Ben's weapon was accurate up to 150 yards. And while the musket was entirely ineffective at 200 yards, Ben's weapon was deadly at the same distance. There was also the time-consuming clumsiness of loading the old muskets, tamping the powder and the wadding and the ball and so forth. Consequently, Ben's weapon could fire 4 times faster, and otherwise, muskets and their ammunition were hard to come by. Heavy, therefore difficult to transport. Sometimes they discharged, and sometimes they did not. And even when they did, you could never depend on a musket ball to take a man down. But Ben Franklin's weapon solved all of those problems. At the same time, it was more devastating psychologically to one's enemy. So why did the Continental Congress turn Ben down? The advice of those strategists, presumably those experts whose military wisdom was most respected, they, you see, were inexplicably enamored of the old musket. They counseled against Ben Franklin's idea, even though today we realize he was right. And so, as I say, his weapon was so efficient, so streamlined, so superior, that our Vietnam warriors employed it widely and effectively. So during our Revolutionary War, there was just that one group of respected combat strategists who did not see the advantage of Ben's secret weapon, even though they, the Native Americans, had invented it. That's right, Ben Franklin's secret weapon, the weapon that most certainly would have stopped the British in less time, with less effort, was the consistently effective, reliable, lightweight, silent, smokeless bow and arrow. And now you know the rest of the story.
And now the rest of the story. You know, genius is a title that we use too often these days, but Benjamin Franklin was absolutely a genius. In our modern era with digital technology at our fingertips, if one of the founding fathers suddenly appeared, Benjamin Franklin would fit in the most. With a twinkle in his eye and a sly grin, he would adapt to our technology with ease and would probably make vast improvements to it. If you can't tell, Benjamin Franklin is one of my heroes. When the colonists went to war against the Redcoats, they wanted the most current weapons available for their soldiers. Now, this is a trap that ensnares most fighting forces. We, humans, tend to think if it's newer, it's better. If it's the newest, most up-to-date weapon, it must be the best, right? Well, not necessarily. As we learned from Mr. Harvey's broadcast, in this case, the colonists were dead wrong. Had they adopted bows and arrows, maybe even crossbows, the American Revolution could have been shortened and many lives could have been saved on both sides. While working on my undergraduate degree, I worked at Fort St. Jean Baptiste State Historical Site in beautiful Natchitoches, Louisiana. In the reconstructed fort, I dressed as a French Marine from the mid-1700s and from 9 to 5 got to reenact life in the colonial period. It was a dream job for a historian. Part of my duties included firing weapons including flintlock pistols, muskets, and even a cannon. The humidity had a lot to do with whether a weapon would fire or not. The last thing a soldier wanted to hear in battle was his gun going click. On a flintlock weapon, you pour a charge of gunpowder down the bore of the gun, then insert the ball or shot down the bore, followed by paper wadding. You use a ramrod to pack the gunpowder, shot, and wadding into place. The wadding keeps the powder and ball in place, and when the spark is added, quickly builds pressure to force the ball out of the gun. After loading the bore, you pull the cock to half cock, pull the frizzen up and add a small amount of powder in the pan, then close the frizzen. The frizzen keeps the gunpowder in the pan and helps to keep it dry. When the weapon's in the half-cock position, it acts like a safety because the weapon will not fire in the half-cock position. This is where the phrase, "don't go off half-cocked," originated. Once ready to fire, you pull the cock back to the second position and pull the trigger. As the flint falls, it does two things. It scrapes against the frizzen while opening it to expose the pan so the sparks fall into the pan of gunpowder. Hopefully, the gun fires. In the summer months, the high humidity often caused the metal parts of the weapon to sweat, which could dampen the powder and keep the gun from firing. A gun going click in the heat of battle was catastrophic. While working at the fort, I always loaded the weapons and explained everything to guests as I went, which took a few minutes. I was in no hurry because I wanted to be sure the visitors understood what was happening. A trained colonial soldier could reload in about 30 seconds. During battle, 30 seconds is a long, long time. A soldier running at an average speed, say 10 miles an hour, can cover about 150 yards in 30 seconds. Muskets were inaccurate at 100 yards and completely ineffective at 200 yards. That's why most colonial armies stood shoulder to shoulder in long lines and fired in volleys. As soon as a volley was fired, the enemy soldiers could run up on the other soldiers before they had a chance to reload. As Mr. Harvey explained, soldiers could fire the bow and arrow 4 times as fast as a musket could be fired. Bows and arrows were much more accurate. There was less equipment needed with a bow and arrow than with a musket. Another one of my duties at the fort was showing guests how to make lead shot from muskets. Soldiers using muskets had to have a supply of lead to make shot. Over a hot fire, the soldier melted the lead in a pan. Once in liquid form, he poured the molten lead into a mold. When cool, he removed the shaped bullet and repeated the process. The soldiers also had to have a supply of paper to use as wadding, along with a supply of gunpowder. A soldier carried a cartridge pouch which had several preloaded cartridges. A cartridge consisted of a piece of paper which held a musket shot and a pre-measured amount of gunpowder. A soldier had to keep spare flints along with a couple of tools to maintain the weapon. When compared to a bow and arrow, the musket required much more equipment. There was more opportunity for something to go wrong. For guerrilla-type warfare, the sound and flash from a firing gun instantly gave away a soldier's position. The silence of the bow and arrow meant the soldier's position would remain concealed. Bows and arrows were far cheaper than muskets. The benefits were numerous. In a letter to General Charles Lee written in February 1776, Benjamin Franklin listed the reasons why the colonials should use bows and arrows. Number 1, because a man may shoot as truly with a bow as with a common musket. Number 2, he can discharge 4 arrows in the time of charging and discharging 1 bullet. Number 3, his object is not taken from his view by the smoke of his own side. Now, when firing in large volleys, the gunpowder made so much smoke that it would cloud the field. Number 4, a flight of arrows seen coming upon them terrifies and disturbs the enemy's attention to his business. Number 5, an arrow striking in any part of a man puts him hors de combat, out of action, until 'tis extracted. Number 6, bows and arrows are more easily provided everywhere than muskets and ammunition. But despite Benjamin Franklin's arguments in favor of bows and arrows, the colonial army fought with muskets. Now, before you saw this video, if you were given the choice of going into battle with a musket or a bow and arrow, which would you have chosen? Knowing what you know now, would you still choose a musket over a bow and arrow? I'm Brad Dison. Thanks for watching. And rather than saying, as Paul Harvey would say, good day, I'll leave you with a phrase that has been frequently requested. And now you know the rest of the story.